next speaker this morning is Dr Eva Neitzert. Now, I totally got the cattle story. I am not an economist, but happily Dr Eva is going to be able to share with us some of the insights into what it is that makes an economic system work and where it is that she believes we're falling down in trying to forestall problems before they start. I, for one, am going to be very interested to hear because, as I said, I failed economics. Dr Eva Neitzert, I'd like to welcome you to the podium today.
Hello and welcome. I'm truly humbled to be in some of the company that I am in today. So I've got 18 minutes, which isn't normally how long I spend talking about what's wrong with the economic system and how we fix it. So I'm going to give you a very, very small snapshot and point you to some of the other places where some of the work we've done is. What I'm talking about today is a project I did at a place called the New Economics Foundation, which is an organisation some of you might have heard of. It's based in London in the UK. It's been around for about 25 years. And it set itself no small task. It wants to build an economic system that's better for people and the planet. And given that it's staffed by quite a lot of young people, we all were naive enough to think we could do that through research. So I'm going to share you some of that research. Before I do so, I just want to talk about our starting point for all of that work, which was that in terms of sustainability, we really believe we face three main challenges. And this expands a little bit on what Ian was saying. The first is those challenges around the environmental issues, so climate change, resource issues, such as peak oil and so on. The second is obviously around the economy. And again, we've all heard lots about that ever since the global financial crisis, and although Australia's been somewhat cushioned from that, we're by no means out of the woods. And the continuing debt crises in Europe, bond yields, there's lots of things that are pointing to the fact that actually over the next, I would say, at least 2 decades, things aren't going to get remarkably better, particularly in the developed economies. But the third area that we don't talk so much about and that doesn't have quite the same prominence is inequality. I think it's a crucial piece of the puzzle that we often leave out. And I'm going to just spend a moment telling you why I think it's so important. Take a look at this graph. It's taken from a piece of work by 2 public health economists called Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, and they wrote a fabulous book called The Spirit Level, which came out a few years ago, which I urgently recommend that you read. What you'll see on this graph is that running up the vertical axis is an index of social problems. And this is a collation of health and social problems. You'll see there's things like life expectancy, math and literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage birth, and the list goes on. Running along the bottom axis is the level of income inequality, lows at this end, highs down here. Now what you see is a really strong correlation. Those countries that have higher levels of inequality perform a lot worse on that index of health and social problems. So the worse the level of inequality within your country, the worse you will do on that index. Now that's really significant, and it's related actually to how we perform as an economy. And the reason for that is that if you think about those social problems that make up that index, things like mental illness, social mobility, obesity, and so on, those are actually really costly problems for all of us in society. Now, we did some modelling at NEF to work out exactly what the cost of those problems is to the UK. Now, the UK is one of the worst performing countries in Europe. And we said, okay, we won't be able to solve inequality, but let's just say we reduce inequality in Britain to the point where it's at the same level as the next worst performing country. So not setting the bar high here. And we found that actually Britain spends 1/3 more on health and social problems than the next worst performing country. Over 20 years, we estimated that the costs associated with inequality came to 20 trillion. Those are huge sums that, you know, inequality is a social and a moral and an ethical issue that we need to solve for those reasons, but it's also an incredibly costly one that actually we simply cannot afford as a society to leave unaddressed. And what's really interesting is that this relationship that you just saw breaks down completely when we just look at average income per head. So this is just looking at advanced economies, with same index running up the vertical axis, and along the bottom you've got gross national income per head. There is no relationship. So what that means is that we won't get ourselves out of these costs associated with inequality just purely through growth. Growth in itself won't solve this problem for us. It's how we distribute our economic resources that's key. And in fact, inequality in most countries has gotten worse over the last 3 decades, and Australia is actually one of those. Okay, so growth in itself won't help us. Of course, there's another dimension to inequality, and that's a global one. So up until now, I've been talking about it within advanced economies. But when we think about the inequalities between nations, those are obviously huge and vast, and something that we're all confronted with on the news when we see famine and all sorts of things in other parts of the world. Now, this is a graph which shows on the vertical axis mean life satisfaction. And running along the bottom axis is per capita GDP. And you'll see that there is a curve that develops. And at the steep end, at the top, so this is where we've got the higher average income per GDP, the relationship, there's a bit of a plateau that happens. So what that means is that actually successive increases in average national income per head will not translate as a matter of course into increases in life satisfaction. So there comes a point where once you've reached a certain level of development, actually growing beyond that point won't necessarily translate into increased life satisfaction. That's not true, however, for the poor countries. So if you look right at this end on the left-hand side of the graph, you'll see Togo and Chad and other countries with very low per capita GDP. Small increases in per capita GDP for those countries would actually translate and facilitate an improvement in life satisfaction. Now, that's really important when we think about climate change. The reason it's important when we think about climate change is that it means that from a social justice perspective, we need to allow within our future scenarios the potential and ability for those underdeveloped countries to grow, to have economic growth. Okay? On the other hand, the advanced countries, where actually increasing growth won't necessarily translate into life satisfaction, we can't continue to sustain economic growth there. We did some work at NEF looking at what a global fair deal on climate change would mean in terms of future emission scenarios for the UK. Okay. The headline says it all: growth is not possible for advanced economies. What we did was we modelled a global fair deal scenario that would enable poor countries to grow, and we said we wanted to keep emissions, atmospheric concentrations to a 450 parts per million scenario, which for those of you who aren't scientists, climate change scientists, that's the level at which we believe that we can avoid some of the worst excesses of climate change. That is more stringent than some of the other models that are done by governments, which sometimes use a 550 parts per million scenario. So what we did is we said, okay, what could the UK emissions be under a global fair deal? Oops. And we found that in order for the UK to have that global fair deal scenario, its emissions would have to fall 36-fold from what they are today. Now that's really significant. So we said, how can the UK achieve a 36-fold reduction in emissions? Well, the first thing we looked at, what would be the energy efficiency we could achieve across all the sectors of the economy? So we modelled what we felt were, based on the best available scientific evidence, the maximum energy efficiency that we could hope to achieve by 2050. And we felt that a 9.5-fold reduction was really at the upper end of the optimistic. We also modelled what the lowest possible carbon intensity of energy could be. So say we retooled in some of the ways that Ian was suggesting this morning and moved away from some of our very carbon-intensive forms of energy to less carbon-intensive forms. Based on the time lag and what it would take to achieve that and the embodied energy, we modelled that we could achieve a 2.8-fold reduction in carbon intensity. Again, now these are quite optimistic scenarios. We found that making adjustments for the maximum energy efficiency across all sectors, for reductions in the carbon intensity of energy, we were still not within the environmental limits for the UK of that 450 parts per million global fair deal scenario. So what that means is we can't rely on science alone. The last thing that remains for us then is actually to reduce output, economic output, if we want to reduce emissions. If we've done everything we can around the energy intensity of that output and we still are not meeting our emissions targets, then what we need to do is actually reduce output. What our model suggested was that GDP in the UK up to 2050, so we're looking at a long-range scenario, would have to fall from its current level of 1.384 billion to 1,025 billion in 2050. So we're talking about a third reduction. That's really significant, because I think there's a lot of talk about global fair deal scenarios around climate change, but there's not often an awareness and a grappling with what that truly would mean for advanced economies. Because it doesn't mean that we can have a measured continued growth for the next 30 years. It actually means we would require degrowth. Now, I might have been young when we were doing this work, I'm still young, but I'm not naive. I don't believe we will have a global fair deal on climate change. However, I think that if we want to get anywhere close to a socially just solution around climate change, a globally socially just solution, we need to think very seriously about how we can build economies in the developed world that don't continue to grow, because otherwise there simply is not the room for other countries to be able to achieve a standard of living that's fair. So, degrowth. Does it mean we're doomed? Well, if you look at this graph again, which we saw before, of mean life satisfaction against income per head, and we say, okay, we're in that top part of the graph in our advanced economies where actually more income doesn't necessarily translate into life satisfaction. Well, the answer could be, no, it doesn't necessarily mean we're doomed. We can achieve quality of life without necessarily having the output that we have at the moment. We need to be smarter about the things we produce and the things we consume, and about the things we value. That said, unplanned degrowth would absolutely mean chaos and disaster. Unplanned degrowth is like having a recession or a depression. It would, if we just dropped economic output, you'd see lots of unemployment and the social misery that comes with that. So we have to be smart about how we retool our economy. Fundamentally, what we have to start thinking about is a preventative approach to some of the social and environmental problems that our economy produces at the moment. Because what we've been doing up until now often is treating the outcomes of the economic system as almost a given. It produces inequality, it produces environmental problems, and we fix them after they've been produced. We tax the rich to redistribute. We take money off them once they've earned it. We clean up environmental problems after they've been produced. This isn't sustainable. We need to start thinking about building an economic system that has more equal and better environmental outcomes from the outset. At the New Economics Foundation, we mapped out a blueprint for what that would look like and called it the Great Transition, and I urge you all to have a look at it. It's about an 80-page document which goes through a number of elements in the economic system that we would need to change. I want to talk to you about what I think is the single most significant element in that blueprint. And it's actually something quite simple, and it's a bit about like what Ian said this morning. It's about making good things cheap and bad things expensive. So coal at the moment is seen as a cheap form of energy, as Ian was saying, but it's only cheap because actually the producers, those who extract the coal, aren't forced to pay the cleanup costs, aren't forced to pay those downstream social and environmental costs. They're not held accountable for those. Those are dealt with later on through all of our taxation. What we need to start doing is incorporating the true costs into the prices of the goods and services that we buy and sell. Because fundamentally, humans are driven by incentives. And prices within the economic system are one of the most fundamental incentives that we all have. And we have an opportunity, by making good things cheap and bad things expensive, to set up a virtuous cycle which looks a bit like this, where if good things are cheap, then consumers are going to be drawn towards the good things. Okay? If consumers purchase the producers of those good things will become more profitable, which in turn will mean that investment is driven to producers of those good things, and the bad things will become unprofitable. Okay? Now, you might say, how do we do all of this? And it's actually not a radically new idea. We do it already with things like tobacco. where we've progressively been putting up the price in order to discourage people from buying cigarettes. And we've seen cigarette consumption decrease. And we need to start looking at other products, mapping out what the true social and environmental costs are, and redefining, essentially, who's accountable for meeting those. So it's not all of us in this room who do so through our taxes, but it's actually at the point of production that those costs start to become incorporated. Fundamentally, what we're doing in that process is redefining profitability. We're making those things that are good for us and for the planet profitable, and those things that are bad for us and for the planet unprofitable. Now, when I've given this talk in less sympathetic audiences, people usually sort of say, oh, you're just doing social engineering. And there's two responses to that, and I'm quite unapologetic about it. One is that actually the economic system we have right now is not some natural system that just evolved. It was man-made as well. The rules of it were very clearly set, and the accountabilities have been very clearly set, and it exists within a legislative framework. And we have actually a right as citizens of a democratic society to define what those rules for our economic system should be. Economic systems are created just like other parts of our society. And the second is, what's wrong with trying to set up a system that actually is about delivering positive social and environmental outcomes? We have an opportunity to redesign our system so that rather than having a goal simply of growth, we have a goal of producing positive social and environmental outcomes. What we're doing in that process is harnessing the power of profit, and it is an incredibly powerful motive, but harnessing it for good. And this is not a huge divergence from what our economic forefathers were trying to do. The economists who argued for the importance of growth didn't do so just because they had growth as their goal in and of itself. They believed that growth equaled something called utility, which for them meant actually the useful things that will improve our quality of life. Where they were misguided was that actually what's transpired is that growth rather than utility has become the goal, and it's led to some of the negative outcomes that we've seen because we've lost that element that we want usefulness. So what we're trying to do now is actually going back to the very fundamental tenets of what economics was all about, which is saying, let's build an economic system that is about utility, about the things that are good and useful for all of us. And that's going to, I believe, very strongly require us to tackle these issues around what makes things profitable, redefining costs, and particularly making those payable at the point of production. But I think this presents for us a fundamental opportunity to create a better world for us tomorrow. As I said, this is only one piece of the puzzle. I urge you all to have a look at the New Economics website to this document called The Great Transition, where we tackle not only the need to make prices reflect value, but we also look at issues such as at what scale should the economy be operating? When is local best? When is regional best? When is international and global appropriate? We look at how we build a financial system that ensures that money flows to where it's needed, all of these big questions. So I urge you to have a look. It is called The Great Transition because we recognise it's a huge task. Thank you.